All right, thank you for joining us. This is a very important session. We have an interview with Daniel R. Street. Daniel spoke to us during our conference on Get Trump in May. He spoke to us about the cases brought against Donald Trump in Georgia. Did an outstanding job. We got a lot of very favorable comments from Daniel's remarks. So I thought it was very important to invite him back to speak to us about some election interference issues, some election malfeasance on the part of the Democrats, and these assassination attempts against Donald Trump. Just a couple words about Daniel R. Street. He's an attorney with over 26 years of experience in civil litigation in state and federal courts in Louisiana. He's a conservative Christian, author, a gun owner, hunter, fisherman, and has been married for over 20 years and is a father and grandfather. So before we jump right into the topics, I see you have some of your books behind you. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about some of the books you've written on Donald Trump.
Sure. Well, once again, thank you for having me. It's great. It's great to be back, and had a wonderful time at the symposium that Davos did back in May, and watched a number of the presentations. So it's really great to be back with you. I will tell you about my books. I've written 4 books. They're all about fake news. 3 of the books are fake news, and they're directed at fake news about Donald Trump. So that's 3 books with a total of 83 chapters in the books. And then if you buy one of the books, you get access to a free chapter. So it's a total of 86 chapters just about media misinformation directed at Donald Trump, his businesses, his administration, his supporters, and his family. And my more recent book is 25 chapters. It covers media misinformation about everything you can think of, everything, President Trump's included, media misinformation and propaganda attacks on Governor DeSantis, if you remember the Martha's Vineyard flights and Don't Say Gay and some other things, covers immigration, gun control, and just a host of media misinformation. So that's what my books are about. I also have a Substack. On Substack, I write about media misinformation, but I also do legal analysis of literally every legal topic that's of national importance. So that's what I've got going on, in addition to practicing law every day, about 7 days a week. So I'm busy.
Well, thank you for writing those books. It's important that people know about the lies the media tells, and it's not easy. I've written some books too, and it's hard to write books, especially when you have a full-time career. I'll just say a couple things about media misinformation that really bother me is the government is colluding, it seems like, with the Biden administration in terms of things like suppressing crime statistics. Some large cities are not supplying their crime statistics to the FBI, so it's not compiled together. And then the employment rate, the jobs created numbers put out by the government are always overstated. And then the next month, not always, but more than 50%, maybe 70, 80, 90% of the time, they're overstated. And then the next month, they're revised downward. Nobody really pays attention to that because the new month statistics are so buoyant. So those kinds of things.
But you're absolutely right. And what you're talking about there reminds me of Mark Twain's quip that a lie will travel halfway around the world while the truth is still getting her boots on. And the media takes advantage of that. It's a truism more than anything else. But I think also that what's worth mentioning here is that the collusion or conspiracy, if you will, between the Biden regime in particular and some private entities to suppress the free speech and speech of Americans goes far beyond even what you mentioned. What you were dealing with was just manipulating data. The Biden regime's actually worked actively with third parties to deplatform Americans, strip Americans of their free speech rights, and suppress the truth. It's not misinformation like the government likes to claim, but what they also call malinformation, which is true information they just don't want you to know. There's a very important case about that. Just went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court decided on a standing issue and sent it back to the district court. That's the Missouri versus Biden case. That case is pending in federal district court in the United States District for the Western District of Louisiana in the Monroe Division. That's in Monroe, Louisiana, where I live, in front of Judge Terry Doty. Judge Doty is a fantastic, conservative Christian, the kind of person you really would want to be on the federal bench. And it's back at him now, before him, and withstanding. And he just recently ruled that Robert F. Kennedy Jr. satisfied the Supreme Court standing opinion. So that case is moving forward. But the important part is that the government, this government, our government, despite the First Amendment, was actively working with third parties to deplatform American citizens and strip them of their free speech rights. It should be the biggest media story about free speech in the history of this country. Instead, the fake news media and the legacy media refuse to report on it virtually.
Yeah. And Hillary Clinton saying that people that purvey so-called misinformation, disinformation should be incarcerated. And she said that in between her fomenting about Trump being a threat to democracy. She said that. And just one other thing I'll mention about the media is that, sometimes the malfeasance is what they don't report. So you mentioned DeSantis sending some illegal immigrants to Martha's Vineyard. Some of them went to the Naval Observatory, where Kamala Harris lives. And despite all the talk, when she had a group of people that were destitute, she didn't have her staff give them one bottle of water, not one apple, not one bottle of water. She just dispatched them as quickly as possible. So, that would have been an.
Well, like, I just commented about the programs that the federal government was running to suppress free speech of Americans. And that's one of the issues that directly addresses what you just commented about, which is the failure of the news media to report on things. This happens all the time. I'm sure we'll talk about it more during our discussion today when we start talking about Kamala Harris and her flip-flops in the media's enabling of her misinformation campaign. But the reality is, what the media doesn't report, what they bury, what they suppress, is every bit as important as the misinformation they actually spread. The problem is, and I've written 4 books about media misinformation, it is incredibly difficult to write anything about the media's unwillingness to tell a story or to report on the story. All you can say is they won't talk about it, so it's a difficult issue to deal with.
Sure. All right. So I think the 2 primary topics we'll talk about for the rest of the session are the elections. To what extent have the Democrats overstepped boundaries in elections, and then the assassination of Donald Trump's level. So if you want to kind of talk a little bit about the elections first, that would be great. And maybe I'll ask you some questions.
Yeah, sure. Well, when we had talked about this a couple of weeks ago, you kind of outlined some topics to discuss. And the first one I wanted to address was one of the issues you brought up about Dominion voting systems. And I think this goes a long way towards election, I guess, it at least undermining the confidence that Americans have in their elections. So Dominion Voting Systems is just a company that makes voting software. And that software is used in about 16 states in some capacity or another. Now, there are a number of different versions of it, and a number of different pieces of hardware and software that Dominion manufactures and or uses or provides. But there's an ongoing litigation in the state of Georgia in a case that's currently known as Curling versus Raffensperger. And I think it's a really important case to outline about Dominion voting systems. Now, let me say, I've written about Dominion. I've written about some of the issues with Dominion. I wrote about the election irregularities in the state of Michigan and the potential for Dominion systems used in Wayne County, Michigan, to have been involved. But what I usually try to do, what I always try to do when I talk about this, is to focus on the expert testimony that's been offered in court. And so there's a world-renowned cybersecurity expert named Professor Alex Halderman, who provided a number of declarations, which are sworn statements under oath, and then he testified under oath in the Georgia case. He's also testified in other states. He testified in Louisiana in December of 2021 about our use of Dominion systems. And so what I like to tell people about it is just to give some observations that the court made in the Curlings versus Raffensperger case, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Yeah. So the court observed this, the federal judge made this observation in October 2020. At the very least, the court cannot fathom why post-election the state and Dominion would not at least be moving toward consideration of the software upgrade option Dominion originally promised, allowing voters to cast ballots that are solely counted based on their voting designations. And here's the important part, and not on an unencrypted, humanly unverifiable QR code that could be subject to external manipulation and does not allow proper voter verification and ballot vote auditing. That's what the federal judge said in October of 2020, literally less than a month before the November 2020 presidential election, about Dominion systems in Georgia. She went on to note, the federal judge there, what Professor Haldeman had said, quote, he indicated the practical feasibility through a cyber attack of causing the swapping or deletion of specific votes cast and the compromise of the system through different cyber attack strategies. Professor Haldeman went on to note that those systems are used, or some version of them are used, in 16 states. In his testimony before the Louisiana State Voting Commission in December of 2021, Haldeman observed that the ballot marking devices, the Dominion ballot marking devices that are used in Louisiana are susceptible to cyber attack that would allow votes to be switched, and no one, not the people operating the system, not the clerks of court who are in charge of the election, no one would even be able to detect it. So you'll see that when these systems are used, another thing that Dominion does is that it's a closed source system, which means no one gets to know and no one gets to have access, meaning the general public don't get to have access to the systems, to the coding behind the systems. And one of the things they do with Dominion is use millions of lines of code for things that are very, very simple. And there are a number of resources on the internet and websites and things that people can go to deep dive into this more. A good one is Fingerprints of Fraud, if anybody's seen that, where a cyber expert talks about all this coding and all these issues. But the reality is these systems are used. They are potentially very suspect. Well, they are suspect, but they're potentially subject to manipulation. And what really just baffles me is why anyone would be against having, number one, paper ballots, which is what Professor Haldeman recommended for Louisiana. Paper ballots, secure computer tabulation systems, and risk limiting audits to make sure those systems are accurately tabulating the votes. But the Democrats are steadfastly against that. And the only really logical conclusion one could reach about that is that they don't want people to have confidence in the integrity of elections, and they want all this secrecy around the systems being used because it makes it more difficult, or if not impossible, to challenge the results.
So to what extent will Dominion systems be used in the 2024 elections?
Good question. As far as I know, all of the same states are using Louisiana, despite getting the issues raised by Professor Haldeman and others almost 3 years ago. It'll be 3 years in December. We haven't replaced those systems. To my knowledge, no one has. Now, the state of Georgia went statewide with Dominion systems. In particular, it's the ImageCast, I forget which ImageCast system they use, in the Democracy Suite. I think it's 5.6 or 5.7. It's still used. And Professor Haldeman's testimony in open court was earlier this year in either January or February, and the court still hasn't ruled on it. So I would say at this point that I wouldn't expect the court to come in and shut down the use of Dominion systems in Georgia this close to the election. So I believe all of those systems are still in use.
So if there was a congressional district that the Democrat got 95% of the vote in, um, to what extent can that be appealed? Um, can you open up the black box at that point? Or how would somebody challenge it? Or, is the Dominion system to be considered like the rule of God? That's just what the facts are.
Well, that's that's a good question. The answer is going to vary depending on what state you're talking about, because every state has different election laws and different procedures for challenging elections, and then you have multiple different Dominion systems that are employed in various different states. So some states are just using the ballot marking devices. Some states are using the entire suite of software and hardware. Some states just have bits and pieces. So what you run into, like for instance, with the system that's used in Louisiana, um, we use a rather dated Dominion system. I believe I believe our Secretary of State obtained all of these systems in 2005. So if you want to challenge, for instance, the election result in Louisiana, um, it, this what the system creates, it's a touchscreen type system where you come in and you punch these different options that you're given, and those are programmed into the touch screen. Now, it's not a touch screen like on your phone. It's the kind of screen that you have to actually physically compress and depress a button. And so literally the election is programmed into the touch screen, and a little sheets put over it. Like, this is how you vote for this person. This is how you vote for that person. Then you cast your vote by pushing another button once you've touched all the election options that you want to touch. Those systems are virtually impossible to verify. Mm-hmm. So it's challenging an election in that circumstance. It's going to be an incredibly difficult thing to do. There are very, very few election challenges here. We just had one in the Caddo Parish Sheriff's Office where a one vote separated the winner and the loser, and that election was overturned, but it had nothing to do with any of the machines. So it's very difficult to challenge elections, and that's one of the real issues. And it's not just Dominion, but with the computerized systems that are used today, particularly when you get away from precinct voting. So Louisiana still uses precinct voting, but you have a lot of these states, like for instance, Arizona and Georgia, where particularly big metropolitan areas, they've created central processing locations where all the votes are sent. Instead of they might be cast in a precinct, but instead of being counted at the precinct, they're sent somewhere else and counted. And it's much, much more difficult to challenge those, as you might imagine, because if, for instance, if a precinct has 1,000 voters, and say 600 of them vote, well, that precinct has 600 votes. So you can verify right then who signed in, who voted, what votes were cast. But if you take all of those votes, you don't count them there at the precinct, you send them somewhere else, and they get mixed in with thousands and thousands of others, you can see how much more difficult it is to find out what the actual, or any challenge, to make any challenge to the results.
Yeah, as far as challenging the results, that's very difficult. In some states, I'm not sure if it's Georgia or Pennsylvania, in the 2020 elections, the Republicans wanted to monitor the vote counting in these huge centers. They're big as a football field. The sheriff said, okay, the law says that you are allowed to enter the facility, but you can just stay right by the fence. You can just stay at the perimeter. You can't go to the tables. So, you had that. And then, if you challenge Dominion, you get sued for defamation. Attorney General of the state can sue for election interference or questioning the results. It's intimidating to question the results.
Yeah, well, there was a lot of poll workers and election observers who were locked out, like you were describing. Some even worse than that. At the Detroit, Michigan, I forget the name of the arena, but where eventually the election observers got just kicked out altogether in 2020. And I actually wrote about that also, about a lot of the shenanigans. And there's been an investigation. Part of the investigation was done by the Michigan legislature, and then some private organizations have also investigated it and produced some reports. But we had intimidation of election observers in Michigan. You had them being locked out where they couldn't perform their statutory. They've got the statutory right to perform various different functions. They were locked out of it. Some people were called names and threatened and different things like that. I think also you were referring to Pennsylvania, what happened in, I believe it was Philadelphia. In a lot of these areas, the COVID pandemic was used to exclude people and say, okay, you can't come in here. You've got to maintain social distancing and stay so far away. And they were using binoculars to try to watch the ballots be counted and all this stuff. And a lot of that was done. There's been a substantial effort by Republicans, by the Republican National Committee and others to prevent a repeat of that. So hopefully this time will go a lot better. There's a lot more eyes on everything this time. We can talk about some of that. But the Democrats are, in my opinion, going to pull out all the stops to try to deliver the presidential election to Kamala Harris. The only question is, are they going to be successful this time? I can tell you it's going to be much more difficult for them to do than it was last time.
Well, that's good to hear. Okay, so other elements of election concerns. So my understanding is the Biden administration is deputizing voter registration drives to government offices like the Small Business Administration. I believe that's happening in Wisconsin, maybe other states. Would you like to say anything about that?
Absolutely, and you are entirely correct. Here's what happened. In 1993, the United States Congress passed a law called the National Voter Registration Act. I've actually written an article about the National Voter Registration Act and how that act is being used to allow non-citizens, illegal aliens, and other ineligible people to be registered to vote. It is commonly known as the motor voter law. And it was called that because it required that states set up voter registration in their Department of Motor Vehicles. And so it's called the motor voter law. It has more provisions than just that. One of the things that the National Voter Registration Act does is require that various different state agencies act as voter registration locations in order to expand the opportunity that people have to register to vote. One provision of the National Voter Registration Act requires that federal agencies to act as state voter registration locations if they're requested to do so by the state and they enter into a written consent agreement. Okay, so this has been going on for a while. What the Biden administration did was in March of 2021, President Biden signed an executive order. It's called the, quote, Executive Order on Promoting Access to Voting. And that executive order essentially requires every federal agency, not every, but most federal agencies or many federal agencies to be designated as voter registration locations under the National Voter Registration Act. And so it vastly expanded the involvement of the federal government in voter registration and required that all these agencies produce these strategic plans to come up and explain how they're going to get more active and more proactive in registering people to vote. It has been the subject of some legal challenges. I tried checking on those yesterday to see if any had been resolved. Best I could tell, none have been resolved. The concern is, of course, that the federal government is going to act as a surrogate for the Democrat National Committee and the Democrat Party, registering as many high propensity or even low propensity Democrat voters as possible, given the hyper partisanship on the part of Democrat elected officials really throughout the country and in the Biden regime in particular. those concerns are obviously well founded. So that's what's going on with that, and it's literally, and one could plausibly say that the federal government's being brought in to basically act like a non-governmental organization and register as many Democrats as possible.
Mhm. It would seem that it's a asynchronous situation. And the government has a lot of leverage. So if I, go to the SB office to get a loan for my small business, and I'm asked if I want to register, and say, no, I don't. I'm already, take care of that at the Republican Party. They'll help me register. There could be some implicit threat that if I don't register there, maybe I won't get my loan, or if it's food stamp office, I won't get my food stamps.
Yeah, well, what we've seen, and there's actually been a number of reports about this. The state of South Carolina, for instance, received complaints, and the legislature investigated it, and the state government investigated it about people who were ineligible, like illegals, submitting voter registration applications through Medicaid offices. And then obviously Medicaid is a state-run program, but it's funded by the federal government. But so this is expanded. It's going on all over the country ultimately. And the real, even beyond the federal government being involved as aggressively and actively in registering people to vote, the real issue is what's being done to screen these people with respect to their eligibility. And I've written about that in the article I mentioned about the National Voter Registration Act. I just wrote another article about the Help America Vote Act, and it hasn't been published yet, but I can assure you, and we can talk about all of that if you're interested, but there is virtually nothing being done to ensure that people who are registering to vote are actually eligible to register to vote. There's very little. What's only being done in most places is what these federal statutes allow to be done. And there is look, this isn't even a debatable point. We know now that there are thousands and thousands of people who are in this country illegally who have registered to vote, which my personal opinion, I can't prove this, I'll just say, but I believe the whole reason I'm watching all the millions of people over the last several years have been allowed to just flood into this country. I think the only thing that makes any sense to me is the Democrats are going to cast as many ballots for them as they possibly can.
Yeah. Yeah, we saw that the Democrats voted against the SAFE Act. That minors, you can elaborate on this, but basically the bill said that illegal aliens can't vote our elections. I believe that certain jurisdictions, like maybe New York City or Washington, D.C., they are allowed to vote in local elections. So anyway, there's that issue, and yeah, under HR 1, which didn't pass, it was very clear that the proposed bill that the Democrats put forward was there would be no identification checks when registering, same day registration as voting, all these things, and even making it illegal for states to try to prune their voter rolls, try to clean up their voter rolls when somebody dies or moves, or what have you. So anyway, those are a couple.
Yeah, well, so I'm going to take the last issue first, which was the law, the proposed voting rights law that the Democrats pushed. And this is important because it's going to dovetail into something we're going to talk about later. Is that statute or that act? Well, let me rephrase it. The bill you're talking about, because it didn't pass, was killed by a filibuster in the Senate. So at the time, the Democrats held the House and they held the Senate, but they held the Senate by 2 votes. And the filibuster was used to kill that bill. That bill would have, as you described, gutted the ability of anyone in this country to maintain election integrity. That was the whole point of it, and in my opinion. And the filibuster killed it. And so the Democrats in the Senate tried to end the filibuster, and they came 2 or 3 votes away from ending the filibuster. And Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema from Arizona, Kirsten Sinema, were the 2 Democrats that voted against nuking or putting into the filibuster. So I don't mean to get ahead. I know we're going to come back to that, but that's how close we were to having the end of election integrity in this country. All right. Now to go back to the earlier issue about the SAVE Act. So what the SAVE Act was proposing to do essentially was to require proof of citizenship whenever people go to register to vote. So it was an effort to amend the National Voter Registration Act to require proof of citizenship whenever someone registers to vote. All right. That didn't pass. It would pass the House, but not the Senate. And President Biden vowed to veto it if it did pass. All right. So one thing that's important, federal law makes it illegal for non-citizens to vote. It's illegal for an alien, whether the person's here legally or not, to vote in our elections. I've covered that in some of the articles I wrote. It's actually a fairly serious crime. But you're correct that some states and some local jurisdictions do allow people who are non-citizens to vote. Now, it's not very widespread, but it does happen. There's a movement in the Democrat Party to expand that. So as we moving forward, we'll see more of that in blue states, so to speak, and in blue jurisdictions. And as you can imagine, that's just going to make the situation more difficult to manage, for the simple reason that a person will be allowed to register to vote for purposes of state elections, but not federal elections. So if you have state elections going at the same time as federal elections, you'll have this situation where a particular voter can vote on some of the issues, but not others. It's going to be a very unmanageable system if it becomes widespread. So it's a real problem. The SAVE Act needed to fix it. And of course, the Democrats considered that to be an assault on democracy.
Yeah. They also voted against deporting illegal aliens that commit murder and that commit serious sex offenses.
Right. That happened just the other day, actually. The Democrats, the majority of Democrats in the United States House of Representatives voted against a deportation. Well, it was going to be a streamlined, accelerated deportation proceeding against illegals who had committed violent crimes, including rape. They voted against that. It's just unfathomable. A lot of this is even hard to explain, but it's hard to wrap your mind around. But how people who vote that way, who vote, hey, we don't want to streamline deportations for violent criminals who are here illegally, claim the effort to deport people who are here illegally and commit violent crimes is an attack on democracy. You know?
Yeah, that's crazy. Well, I think in addition to wanting to, win elections, the Democrats are very welcoming of all these immigrants because I think they want to capsize the country. If they want to give everything away for free, you can't give everything away for free to almost everybody in the world. You can't have like 100 million people come here, or even 50 million people, and offer them free education, free housing, which you see they're giving them mortgages and advances, and actually pricing local residents out of the housing market. In Springfield, Ohio, the vouchers are $3,000. So you have illegal immigrants that can pay more than a long-time resident. So you offer them free healthcare, free everything. They don't want to work. They want you to pay people for not working. It will destroy the country, which may be part of their agenda. Anyway, you mentioned the filibuster. And you can explain a little bit about what the filibuster is. And Kamala Harris said that if she's elected, she'll end the filibuster to get her abortion bills.
Yeah, sure. I'd be delighted to talk about the filibuster. So the first thing for people to understand is, what's the filibuster? It's an obscure term. It's a parliamentary procedural term in the United States Senate. All right. So essentially, laws in this country, both in the federal government, are passed by the House, they're passed by the Senate on a majority vote. So there's 435 members of the United States House. There's 100 United States senators. Every state, all 50 states, have 2 U.S. senators. States have different numbers of House members based off of population. So, for instance, Wyoming has 1 member of the U.S. House. The state of California has, I believe, 54 now. But both of them have 2 U.S. senators. In the United States Senate, there's a rule that's been in place almost since the founding of the institution, shortly after it went into effect. It's called the filibuster rule. Now, that rule's changed over time. The easiest way to describe it is this. The filibuster rule is a rule that requires when a particular law is being debated in the Senate. The filibuster rule requires that a supermajority of senators, right now the rule requires 60 United States senators, vote to end debate. All right, that's called cloture. So what happens is there's a law being debated by the United States Senate, and a minority of senators are against it, and they don't want that law to pass, but it has a majority vote. And there's enough senators who are in favor of it to pass it. The minority can, what used to happen, it was actually very entertaining back in the day, for the filibuster rule to be used, the filibustering senators had to remain on the floor of the United States Senate arguing and debating the bill. And if you couldn't get, at the time, back whenever that was the rule, it took 67 votes to end debate. If you couldn't get 67 senators to vote to end debate, the debate would just keep going. But the rule used to require there to actually be a U.S. senator on the floor debating. One of our U.S. senators from Louisiana named Huey Long engaged in a number of filibusters in the U.S. Senate back in the early 1930s, and he spoke for like 40 hours. I might have that wrong, but a long, long time. And well, the Senate became, I guess you would say, more modernized, maybe one way to put it, and did away with the requirement that there actually be a person on the floor debating. So now they just vote on whether they're going to end debate. And it takes 60 votes to end debate. So if there's a law that's the Senate is trying to pass, and the majority of senators are in favor of it, and the minority of senators are against it, and those senators filibuster, the majority has to get 60 votes or more to end debate for the law to then be voted on. So the filibuster is used to kill things in the Senate where there's a majority in favor of it, but not a big enough majority. So that's what the filibuster is. And it's actually an oversimplification, but that's hopefully a good definition or explanation of it.
It is. So, what's the threat? Why is it anti-democratic that Kamala Harris would move to kill the filibuster?
Well, that's a good question. And I think, let me start by noting that this is another instance, and hopefully we'll have the chance to get into this more. This is another illustration of Kamala Harris flip-flopping, because we got to back up a little bit. Whenever President Trump was elected in 2016, the Republicans had a thin majority in the U.S. Senate. They had a 1-vote majority, they had 51 votes. And at that time, 61 U.S. senators in 2017 signed a letter reaffirming the right of the minority in the Senate to use the filibuster, with basically a promise, hey, we're going to protect the filibuster. Because they knew that there would be a movement by some Republicans to try to nuke or kill the filibuster, because the Democrats were going to use it to stymie President Trump's agenda. All right. One of the signatories to that letter, one of the 30 Democrat senators that signed that letter, promising that the filibuster was a bedrock of democracy and that it needed to remain in place, was Kamala Harris. All right. She's flip-flopped on that. No surprise there. She flip-flops on everything. And now says that she'll end the filibuster if she gets in the White House. Now, the filibuster, look, people of different political persuasions can have legitimate disagreements about the validity or propriety of the filibuster. Okay, so I don't mean to say anybody who thinks getting rid of the filibuster is anybody who thinks that's a good idea is, un-American. There are a lot of people who want to get rid of the filibuster, but the filibuster, in my view, is a very important tool because it protects people from what it might be characterized as the tyranny of the majority. All right. It requires that there be a substantial majority, not a bare majority, in order to impose policy in the United States Senate. I think it's an important part of the Senate. It's an important part of the Senate's history, and it's an important part of our Republican form of government. There are conservatives who disagree with that. And now the Democrats have gone full circle. Remember I said in 2017, 30 of them, 30 U.S. senators, Democrat U.S. senators were in favor. We got to save the filibuster. Whenever they got their bare majority, and Senator Manchin and Senator Sinema were the only two Democrats to vote to preserve the filibuster, but Sinema and Manchin got censored by the Democrat Party, and that's censor with a U. So that's rebuked and criticized publicly in a vociferous way over opposing the party big shots. So the thing about that bothers me or troubles me the most about the about face the Democrats have done on the filibuster is not that some of them want to do away with the filibuster. It's that the ones who want to do away with the filibuster, for a large part, in fact, all of the U.S. senators who are still in the United States Senate, who were there, Democrats, and all of the Democrat U.S. senators who were there in 2017 and signed that letter saying that we got to protect the filibuster, who are still in the U.S. Senate right now, I think it's 27 of them, all of them want to do away with the filibuster now, except for Joe Manchin. So the problem is this: when they're in the minority, it's the filibuster is a bedrock principle of democracy. When they have a bare majority, they want to do away with it. It's just another illustration that a lot of the political Democrat machine in Washington really doesn't believe anything.
Yeah, despite Kamala Harris saying her values haven't changed.
You're right.
Anyway, maybe we'll talk about Robert F. Kennedy Jr. He had a very difficult time getting on quite a few state ballots. Yeah. And then once he was on the ballot and he decided to withdraw from the presidential race to support Donald Trump, many states will not take him off the ballots, probably to confuse the voters, probably to siphon off votes from Donald Trump. So maybe you can explain Democrat thinking, why it's in the spirit of democracy to not put candidates on the ballots and then to leave people that don't want to run, put them on the ballots.
I always approach this particular issue, and it's broader than just the primaries. I approach it with the understanding, or trying to share with people the understanding, that the Democrat Party is not very democratic. Okay. And what you're talking about is a good illustration of it. I mean, so we had President Biden, who the Democrat Party machinery performed all manner of machinations to try to prevent him from having any Democrat primary opposition. And then that morphed into, okay, so people didn't get the chance to have a choice in the Democrat Party about who their nominee was going to be. Then the party just decides we're going to scuttle Biden altogether and promote Harris. And then nobody ever had the chance to this, as of this moment. No one in the Democrat Party has ever had the opportunity, not in 2019 and 2020 when Kamala Harris ran for the Democratic nomination, and not now. No Democrat voters ever had the opportunity to cast a primary ballot for her, because she dropped out in 2019 before any of the actual voting started. Now, let me switch around to the issue you actually raised, which is keeping third parties off the ballot. All right, so the Democrat Party went to tremendous lengths all over the country to keep third parties off the ballot. Not just Robert F. Kennedy. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. They've done it to Jill Stein in the Green Party. They've done it to Cornel West. They've done it to a number of other people. Now, let me preface my remarks here by saying, I don't think there's anything nefarious about a party working to have a ballot be the most favorable that it can be. I expect the Republicans, for instance, if a Republican's in a particular state, look, here's a good illustration of this. This is what the Democrats did to try to help John Tester in his last election in 2018. The Democrats helped bankroll getting the Conservative Party candidate on the Senate race, so that guy would siphon votes away from the candidate for the Republicans at the time was Matt Rosendale. All right, so the Democrats will promote a third party if it's going to undermine somebody else, and undermine third parties if it's going to undermine them. Now that's politics. Okay, so I don't mean to call that out, because really the Republicans should have been more proactive in keeping the Conservative Party off and getting the Green Party on in Montana, which they actually did this time. So the problem, as I see it, is that the Democrats who hold elected office hold public office, and they do the bidding of the Democrat National Committee. So let me expound on that, because you briefly mentioned it. So there was this really aggressive effort by the Democrat Party to keep Robert F. Kennedy off the ballot in as many states as possible. You may remember he was having a hearing. He was fighting to get on the ballot in Pennsylvania. And this is another thing that Democrats do. They got so many judges that are just doing their bidding. Robert F. Kennedy had a hearing before a judge in Pennsylvania, and he was supposed to be there in person, and his flight got delayed. So no fault of his own. It's not, he's trying to get there. Anybody can tell you, I practice law, it'll be in October, it'll be 28 years. All right. What anybody in the world would do with a party litigant who's having to fly in from out of state and they get a delay in a layover is tell everybody to chill out for an hour and wait, right? What happened in Pennsylvania? The judge says, oh, he's not here. Bam, you lose. And so Robert F. Kennedy's like, he gets to the courthouse an hour after the judge has dropped the hammer on him because he couldn't get there in time because his flight got delayed. I mean, it's just that's not democratic. But what happened is what you alluded to in the state of Michigan is a good for instance. The Democrats fought to keep Kennedy off the ballot. He got on the ballot. Then he decides he wants to be off the ballot whenever he drops out. Right?
Right.
Who fought to keep him on the ballot? The Secretary of State, Jocelyn Benson, the Democrat Secretary of State. Now, this is a public office this person holds. But what does she do? She's the only one who can do it. And that's why it went to the Michigan Supreme Court. And the Michigan Supreme Court said, look, it's within the discretion of the Secretary of State to keep the person on the ballot. So she literally went to court after the Democrats had fought to keep the man off the ballot. And he decides he's going to drop out. And she goes to court to battle all the way to the Michigan Supreme Court to keep him on. Now, that case is in federal because there's a federal challenge going to all that right now. I haven't evaluated it, so I don't, I can't tell people about whether it'll be successful or not, except I always tell people that if your chance at justice is federal court, that's not a whole lot of a chance, not much of a chance in most cases. So I really don't expect that to go anywhere, but hopefully I'm wrong about that. But so that's the kind of machinations that have gone on all over the country. They're doing the same thing to Cornel West, the same thing to Jill Stein. And get a load of this. In Montana, when the Democrats were trying to keep Jill Stein and the Green Party off the ballot, their contention was that the Green Party nominated her in violation of the bylaws and rules and protocols of the Green Party. Now, the Democrats just change theirs whenever they want to create a new way of doing things, but somebody else does it, they're trying to kick them off the ballot. So it's, look, the public opinion poll is pretty clear. The vast majority of people think that Kamala Harris was anointed as the Democrat nominee in a very undemocratic, unfair manner. And that's even Democrats who believe that. So, I think it's obviously very, very poor optics, but in many cases, just completely, utterly incongruent with their claims about trying to protect democracy. And in fact, most of everything that we've been talking about is the manner in which the Democrat Party literally undermines democracy.
Right. Did you know if Jill Stein and or Cornel West will be on ballots?
They will. They'll be on ballots in various different states. Jill Stein, I haven't done an inventory of all of the states, but I know that Jill Stein has successfully made it on the ballot in a host of states. There's a few where she didn't. Cornel West, there's a few where he did. There's quite a few where he didn't. But I haven't done an inventory of it. But they will be. Jill Stein's going to be on the ballot in some swing states, and she will probably. Oh, well, let me say this. Hopefully, President Trump wins by such a margin that the Green Party's votes don't matter. Let's hope for that. But the potential will exist in a number of states for her to be a spoiler, so to speak.
And then you mentioned Kamala Harris didn't win any primary votes. Can we talk a little bit more specificity as how the Democrat Party rigged the primaries for Kamala Harris? I guess there were no debates.
Yeah, well, sure. They actually rigged the primaries for Biden. And, in fact, a number of states in the here's what happened. Robert F. Kennedy Jr. was not going to win the Democrat nomination. Okay. But he was going to draw enough votes to undermine and probably embarrass Biden and the Democrats and put him in put the party in a very difficult position about debates. So, if the primaries started happening and Robert F. Kennedy's getting 25, 30% of the vote, then it was going to be a public relations nightmare for the Democrats. So what they did was go in and kill all the debates. So we're not going to have any debates. They shut down the primaries altogether. Let me see. I believe it was Florida, North Carolina. There were 3 states, if I recall. Let me see. Yeah, and Delaware. Florida, North Carolina, and Delaware all killed their primaries. Democrat primaries, so that their voters didn't get to vote. The Democrats in those states didn't get to vote at all. And then the primaries were, and basically it had to do mostly with timing, but in a host of states, they made it to where third parties couldn't get on the ballot not third parties, I'm sorry, that other Democrats other than Biden couldn't get on the ballot. In a few states, there was some litigation where some more obscure Democrats were able to get on the ballot. But literally what it boiled down to was, here's what was going on. The Democrats knew that Joe Biden was I tell everybody he has half a noodle floating around in his brain. He's just got senility. And they knew that. And they knew, wow, if he's got to go out and make all these public appearances and do debates, this is going to be a disaster. So they killed all of that and ran everybody off so that they couldn't run against Biden. That doesn't sound very democratic, does it? And so that he could be anointed. And then he went and had the debate with President Trump in June of this year, and everyone got to see in live, real time, how compromised he was from a cognitive perspective. And so what the Democrats did then was force him out and just literally put Kamala Harris up without her ever having gotten a vote from anybody, from any Democrats. She got delegate votes because they were told, hey, you got to vote for her. I mean, to me, it just boggles my mind that it was even possible. And if you're a political party, this is one thing that always gets me about Democrats. It literally just it blows me away. When the party bosses come up with something and they say, here's how it's going to be, the rank and file in the Democrat Party, they just fall in line. If I'm a Republican, I've been a Republican all my life, except for a couple of years that I changed to independent after 2016. And then I went back to being a Republican. And if the party bosses try to do anything like that in the Republican Party, there'd be millions of people like me screaming bloody murder. But what do the Democrats do? Oh, hey, great. We get rid of Biden. He needs to go anyway. And then they get somebody that nobody ever voted for. And they're fine with that. And they call that defending democracy.
Right. Well, and then since Kamala Harris became the nominee, became the candidate for the Democrats, she's had almost no interviews, no real serious substantive hard question interviews. She did do one debate, but very little is coming from her. Not much you can find on her policies, and that in itself is undemocratic because the United States wants to have an informed electorate and wants to be, should be governed with the consent of those citizens. And if you don't know what the policies of a candidate are, then you can't have an informed electorate, and you can't have the consent of the citizenry if you don't know what it is you're supposed to consent to. So I think her approach, and it's an approach to run out the clock. It's approach that maybe it's evidence that her team doesn't feel she's intelligent and answer any questions, or that her policies are vastly different than what most Americans want. But for whatever reason, a candidate should put their policies and platform in the public's view so they can make a decision. So anyway.
Yeah. Well, I wrote a 3-part article series at my Substack about Kamala Harris, and it's called "Will the Real Kamala Harris Please Stand Up?" And the reality is, and I covered this, look, what the American people need on Kamala Harris is a deep dive and some actual, real, basic, fundamental journalism about who she is, And the reality is that her father was a Marxist economics professor at Stanford. And when I say Marxist, in my article, I quote from one of his books. I mean, he was a Marxist. Anybody else would say, hey, your dad's a Marxist. What do you think about Marxism? They won't even ask her, won't even bring it up, won't even tell people. And when I say Marxism, I mean as in Karl Marx communism, okay? Now, she failed the bar exam the first time she took it, and I covered that in my article, and that puts her in the bottom 25% of people that went to a major university like she did, and that's in California. So 75% passed at the time she took it back in the late 80s, early 90s, and she failed it. Look, this is at its bottom line is a person that's just not very smart, okay? And if you look, I covered a bunch of her word salad statements, but community banks are community banks because they're in the community, and just Looney Tunes nonsense that comes out of this person's mouth. And it's time after time after time after time. And that's why they're trying to hide her. That's why they don't want her to do real interviews. That's why they won't allow her to do a debate on Fox News, is because if she starts getting tough questions, then she's not going to be able to field them. You've seen what she does. She did it yesterday or the day before, maybe, in a very friendly interview with a friendly member of the fake news media throwing her softballs. And she comes off literally like somebody that just fell off a turnip truck. I mean, this person's not a serious person. She's not a deep thinker. And what they're trying to do is just a version of what they did with Biden, really in 2020 and throughout his administration, which is hide him from people. And they're trying to do the same thing for her for different reasons. President Biden was just losing his faculties due to being elderly, and he had the strokes 20 years ago, and I'm sure that's contributed to his mental decline. Kamala Harris has got all of her marbles. She just didn't start with that many to begin with, and so they're just trying to hide her out. And when she did do one debate with President Trump, President Trump had to debate both the moderators and her, and they fact-checked President Trump very unfairly and incorrectly in many instances, and didn't fact-check I think they fact-checked one lie that she told, and she told like a host of them. So the other reason that they don't want her to sit for debate, for interviews, for real interviews, is she has flip-flopped left and right. And I covered that in the article series I was talking about. And we can go into that. I don't know if I'm jumping ahead, but she has flip-flopped on every significant policy issue you can think about, from energy, to immigration, to gun policy, to green energy, to hydraulic fracturing, to defunding the police, to bail reform. And we can go into that deeper. But if she were to sit down with a member of the media that was the least bit hostile to her, she would get utterly dismantled. And you see what happens in these friendly interviews, and they ask her, hey, how are you going to control inflation? What are you going to do? You get this babbling word salad from her just imagine if somebody was attacking her. And so they're just trying to hide the person from the public, so not enough people figure out that she's not up to the job.
Yeah. Um, it's a kind of a scary situation where one of the main candidates claimed to fame as having worked at McDonald's, and that might not even be true.
Probably not true.
So anyway, I know there's a lot to talk about as far as elections. We also want to get to assassination attempts. So I'll just bring a couple issues to the table. You can respond to some or all or none of them or whatever else you want to say about the elections. But just a few days ago, Zelensky was in Pennsylvania. I understand he arrived in Pennsylvania from a U.S. government aircraft. And it was basically a political speech that he made. He, was very critical of vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance and very praising of Harris, Biden administration. So that's one issue. Another issue is the Biden administration tried to buy the votes of millions of college students by offering to cancel their loans. And there was no movement. There was no grassroots movement. There were no protests in the streets by students that, honestly do have quite a bit of loans. It is not easy to repay those. I did that, and it was a long time and a lot of misery. But but there were no lawsuits against the government by students. There were no protests. There were no trade associations, no trade groups that wanted the student loans canceled. And there are people that are more deserving of having their loans canceled. If anybody, people that get a disease or die. If you die, you get government loans. Your family still has to repay those loans. So that's one thing. The other thing is, I don't know a lot about this, but I understand the Harris campaign misappropriated $91 million that belonged to the Biden campaign or from the primaries, whatever, something like that. And then the other issue is smurfing. So I understand that there's a lot of foreign money going into the Harris campaign, from a small number of donors making big contributions, but it's getting parceled out in small increments to a lot of Americans and flowing into the Harris coffers that way. So those are some ideas you can invest, whatever.
Yeah, sure. The one issue I haven't had the chance to look at, and as I alluded to before, I have a real job that's incredibly time consuming, and so I got these lists of things I want to investigate. You mentioned about Ukrainian President Zelensky being brought to this country on federal government planes, and then basically going on what I think could accurately be characterized as a campaign appearance on behalf of the Democrats and the Harris Waltz campaign. There are a number of people that I follow on social media and in media that are investigating that as to whether it was illegal. I haven't had a chance to look into it. I can't imagine that it was legal. I mean, we have the Hatch Act, which would prohibit federal employees from doing that. So I suspect that ultimately, after all that shakes out, we're going to have some illegal activity associated with it. But from a political perspective, it was just wildly inappropriate to have a foreign head of state who has been, by the way, the beneficiary of a massive amount, hundreds of billions of dollars of American largesse, to come to this country and weigh in on our political campaigns and elections. It's not going to go over. And the thing about it is, a lot of the things that the Democrats do, and the Republicans too, for that matter, that they think in their vacuum are going to be a good idea, turn out not to be a good idea, and that's one of them. Now, one of the other issues you talked about was smurfing, and I think that's a critically important issue I'd like to address. And if I may, let me explain what we're talking about. So, smurfing is a term that I honestly don't know who came up with it. That someone came up with to describe a way of hiding campaign contributions. So what happens are, in a smurfing episode, is someone who gives a large amount of money. Oftentimes, these are very wealthy people. In many cases, they're foreigners, and in some instances, they're even foreign governments are involved, we believe. And they give a massive amount of money to, it could be to a party, it could be to a campaign. And when the entities that get this money have to report to the Federal Elections Commission, or the FEC, they do these reports. It's like, well, we got $100 million from this guy, or however much. We can't report that. So they divvy it up amongst thousands and thousands of individuals. And what you wind up with over time is the massive accumulation of donations on behalf of people who did not make them. And so if you've paid attention to any of this in the press, and you've seen James O'Keefe do undercover videos, there's a number of states that are now investigating a particular entity that's associated with some of these investigations called Act Blue. And then now there's a congressional investigation. A number of senators, like for instance, Marco Rubio, has been railing about all this on social media for a couple of years. But the Republicans a lot of times are a little bit, and then you go talk to the person, and the person hasn't given anybody anything, or gave somebody a little small amount of money. So this is a real problem, and it's the way, in my view, that Democrats have been able to just massively out fundraise Republicans for the last several election cycles. Now, the important part about this is not just that it's being investigated, but Act Blue is kind of the lightning rod for all of this. But if you dig into it deeper, you'll see that Act Blue is the tip of the spear. There are dozens, maybe even hundreds of NGOs, that's non-governmental organizations. So these are organizations that are formed under federal law most of the time as nonprofits. And they're out engaging in all this political activity, so it gets real iffy there. And they're essentially gathering all this money and then hiding who it's coming from. All right. And there's some people doing some wonderful work. If you have the opportunity, check out a guy named Jay Valentine. He has a website called Omega for America, and he has a Rumble page. And they have videos where they created this database. They took every FEC contribution that exists in the federal database, and along with a bunch of other data using fractal technology, and did a deep dive into where all this money's coming from. And Act Blue is an important player, but they're one of many. This is a massive dark money operation done by with dozens, if not hundreds, of actors, all working to promote the left and the Democrats. And it's something that moving forward, the Republicans are going to have to get on top of and put a stop to, frankly. Otherwise, it'll never stop, and we'll wind up with a situation where Republicans are just literally overwhelmed with foreign money in elections.
Okay, great. Do you want to say anything else about elections? We also do want to cover the assassination attempts.
Yeah, one thing I did want to briefly address, if you don't mind, is some of Kamala Harris's leftist extremism that the media has been hiding in an effort to help her get elected. And so this is really important for people to know. Like, you take immigration. She once likened the Border Patrol to the Ku Klux Klan. She claimed that illegals, people who are here illegally, who are violating a host of laws, are not criminals. She advocated for asylum and refugee status for virtually everybody that enters this country illegally. She wants to provide citizenship to tens of millions of illegals, and she's made public statements in support of ending deportation. When she was the DA in San Francisco, she protected illegals with federal efforts to deport people. So, and she did that to a number of people who had been convicted by her office of crimes. She protected them from deportation, and several of those people went on to commit very serious crimes, including murder. So her history on immigration is absolutely off the charts radical. She advocated for banning, private health insurance. So think about that. Those of you who are watching this and you have your own insurance, she literally supported banning private health insurance. She was a co-sponsor of Senator Bernie Sanders. If you know him, he's a progressive socialist from Vermont, of his bill for Medicare for all. So she wanted everybody in America, even if they're here illegally, by the way, to be covered by Medicare and strip you of your private health insurance. On green energy, she wanted to ban what's called hydraulic fracturing. Hydraulic fracturing is, real simply, it's an extraction technique that's used to access natural gas deposits that are deep down in bedrock, in shale. And it's basically putting fluid under pressure and using that to blast your way into these shale formations. What it's done is opened up a vast amount of access to cheap natural gas deposits. We have a big shale formation in Louisiana. There's a giant one in Pennsylvania. And she supported banning it. In fact, when she was running for the Democrat nomination in 2019, she said she would ban it on federal land on day one. All right. She advocated, and what that would do would make energy much more expensive. All right. Then she advocated for everybody to have a federal job. Just think about that. Every person in America would have the right to have a federal job. What kind of loony nonsense is that? She's an anti-gun radical. She wants to ban guns. She wants what they call mandatory buybacks. Oh, I'm not in favor of banning guns. I'm going to mandatorily make you turn it in. We're going to give you fair, what we consider to be fair market value. That's a gun ban. She signed a brief to the United States Supreme Court, an amicus brief, and when the Heller case, which is the case in 2008, the United States Supreme Court recognized the Second Amendment grants the people of this country an individual right to bear arms. She signed a brief asking the United States Supreme Court to rule that the Second Amendment didn't mean anything, okay, and didn't grant you a right to anything. Her criminal justice reform program, when she ran in 2019, included restoring the right of convicted criminals to vote. She called for defunding the police. She wanted to do away with cash bail. You see how the disaster that is in New York and some other states where you got a revolving door for criminals. They just arrest them and then turn them loose because they don't have to post bail. She did all of that and more. I'm going to skip over it so we can move on and talk about other things. What has she done since? Reversed her position. She's not against fracking anymore, she says. She's not in favor of convicted felons having the right to vote. She even advocated in one interview for people in jail right now to have the right to vote. And she backtracked off of that a couple of days later. She says now that she's a gun owner, if you break in her house, she's going to shoot you. Transgender radicalism, she bragged about forcing the state of California to pay for inmates gender reassignment surgery, male inmates, and then force the state to put them in female prisons where we now know what they do is rape, pillage, intimidate, and threaten people. All right. She gets to flip-flop on all that. What does the media do? Nothing. They don't tell anybody. It's up to people like you and me. It's up to the Trump campaign. It's up to some conservative journalists to let people know the truth about this person. The simple fact of the matter is she is a radical leftist extremist, and she's being protected by the media. So thank you for letting me go on that rant there, because it was really
sure. I share your sentiments. He actually raised money for a defend the police movement, or to get the violent protesters, the Antifa people, out of jail.
That's right.
Yeah. So anyway, all right, maybe we'll shift gears and talk about the assassination attempts. So do you think the Secret Service under the Biden administration is doing everything in its power? The Biden administration is doing everything in its power to protect Donald Trump?
No. I mean, that's it's not even close. Now they're doing better now, but the episode in Butler, Pennsylvania, in particular, back in July, is proof positive that the Biden administration is not doing nearly enough to protect President Trump. I can elaborate on that.
Yeah, so they have a $3.5 billion budget, and of course, the sitting president deserves a lot of protection. His family, the vice president, other dignitaries, but so does another very strong contender for that office. So where did the breakdown happen? One
Well,
thing that kind of bothers me is before the assassination attempts, when the government decided to raid Donald Trump's residence, Mar-a-Lago, Florida, they were authorized. The FBI was authorized to use deadly force. So there's that. There's a situation where the Biden administration would not provide Secret Service protection for Robert Kennedy, despite the assassination of his father, of his uncle. Um, so anyway, it doesn't seem like the Biden administration is dedicated to preserving the lives of their political rivals.
yeah. I think what I've done is about this topic is just to outline a few things that don't add up, that don't make any sense. And I think that people need to reach their own conclusions. And of course, part of the issue we're dealing with here is there's been a lack of transparency by the Biden administration and the Department of Homeland Security, the Secret Service, about the events that took place in Butler, Pennsylvania, in particular. So, it's one of those situations, as is typically the case when we deal with the efforts to kill someone, a head of state or a former head of state. Is in this country we seem to have a big cover up every time, and I think this time is at least maybe it's not a cover up completely, but it's that there's a lack of willingness to tell everybody what happened. But here's what we know: the shooter was on a rooftop approximately 140 yards from President Trump. Okay, now that rooftop should have been secure, period. And if you've seen Benny Johnson's documentary about this, it's only about 20 minutes long. And he goes up there with a couple of representatives. One of them was Corey Mills. I forget the other gentleman. They were Army snipers. And they went and looked and said there were 7 rooftops, according to them, within kill range, so to speak, for a professional sniper. None of them were cleared by anybody. None. And this was the closest. This one was 140 yards from the president. Now, I can tell you, you mentioned whenever you introduced me that I'm a hunter, and I've hunted all my life. And I've hunted deer and elk and bears and big game. I do a lot of small game hunting too. But I've shot rifles all my life. I can tell you that a 140-yard shot is a giveaway shot that any experienced rifleman would make. Period. That is a simple shot. And for a trained sniper, I know this guy Crooks was not a professionally trained sniper. Apparently he wasn't. And thankfully he wasn't. But for a trained sniper, for a person who has the expertise to execute a shot from 1,000 yards or 1,200 yards or 1,500 yards, 140-yard shot under those conditions would be unmissable. I mean, you couldn't miss. And Corey Mills, Representative Mills, talked about that on that documentary. So this is a really simple issue. That rooftop should have been secured. All those other rooftops should have been secured. The tower, the water tower, should have been secured. None of it was secured. Now, go ahead.
Well, the head of the then head of the Secret Service said the reason why the rooftop on which the shooter shot the rounds was slanted. It was slanted. It wasn't very much of a slant. It was maybe like this. It wasn't like this.
Yeah.
And even if it was, one of the gentlemen I think you're referring to, one of the congressmen, a 70-year-old gentleman, he was able to climb up on the roof and navigate it and walk around. So anyway, I mean, that seems like the lamest excuse possible. I mean, the president or presidential candidate should be protected by the fiercest warriors and people
Yeah.
that not afraid of climbing on roofs.
Yeah. Another excuse was that it was too hot. It was too hot. Metal roof, it was hot. If you've seen any of the pictures that have been released of the various different law enforcement personnel who are on the roof after the shooter had been killed, and they're all just standing around, and one guy's up there later with a water hose, sanitizing the crime scene long before that should have been done, which is another issue. I keep hearkening back whenever I study on this and read about it and watch the videos about it to, the Kennedy assassination, whenever the president's limousine was sanitized at Dallas Memorial. There's not even good pictures of it with all the blood stains and everything. They had the testimony had to be from nurses. Came in and said, oh, there was blood here and there was blood there. And I mean, they came and did it again and just start sanitizing the evidence. But, the other thing they didn't do was they didn't secure the perimeter surrounding the event properly. They didn't secure the water tower. I said that already. Another thing that just absolutely baffles me is they did not have, and when I say they, I'm talking about the Secret Service and local law enforcement who are partnered in this effort to protect President Trump and protect the people at the rally, by the way. They did not have integrated communications, which to me is just, I mean, look, you've seen the video, and it's a couple of minutes before the guy takes a shot at President Trump. You can see the guy, the shooter, running around on the roof. Nobody saw him. The Secret Service guys didn't see him. The counter snipers didn't see him. And they didn't get President Trump off the stage. Then you had the local law enforcement who reported the guy, found him suspicious. People yelling, hey, there's a guy with a gun up there. They don't even, wouldn't you immediately notify Secret Service, and protect the protectee? They didn't, they didn't have integrated comms. So then on top of that, we learned later that the actual usual detail, for the most part, most of the members of the Secret Service detail that were going to be there were sent to, I believe it was Pittsburgh, for an event that the First Lady was having. And President Trump got a bunch of Department of Homeland Security people who got to watch a video for about 30 minutes about how to protect somebody. Now, I'm not knocking I'm sure those Department of Homeland Security people are good at what their job is, but protecting high value targets is not their job. And you can see what the result was. So yeah, it's hard not to conclude, just with the publicly available information, it's hard not to conclude that what went on in Butler, Pennsylvania was allowed to go on.
Yeah, I just read this morning, I think from Blaze Media, that the head Secret Service in charge of advanced planning for Trump he knew that there was a credible threat 3 days before. He knew there was a credible threat 3 days before, and he didn't communicate that to the team on the ground. And, you mentioned failure in communications. Well, guarding the president or presidential candidate, it's not just like one communication. My understanding is there's the primary one, there's a backup one, there's a third one, and all three of those broke down, and they were using their cell phones. And then 3 minutes before the shots were fired, local law enforcement realized there was somebody on the roof, and they were approaching the building, but nobody, maybe because they didn't have communications, that nobody told the Secret Service next to Trump that there's a threat, maybe he should step aside for a bit.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, to me, it's unfathomable. I can't help but my concern is that let's look at a couple other things that are just suspicious. Look at the news media that was there filming live. CNN, when's the last time CNN covered one of President Trump's rallies live? According to media reports I read, it had been over a year, but they were at that one. And you add all that stuff together and you look at all this and you have to think, I just got to tell you, I have to think that President Trump was not supposed to walk away from that, and then we would have had a real cover up. But it was a startling level. If I may borrow from Dan Bongino, I'm sure most of the people that watch this will know Dan Bongino, and he said it was just an absolutely cataclysmic failure and a startling level of utter incompetence. Best case scenario. So,
did you hear anything about somebody from Washington, D.C. had visited the Crook's house um, maybe like 8 times before the assassination attempt? There was some geofencing done. Just something suspicious about it. Somebody from Washington had visited, appears, the Crook's house quite a few
yes,
times.
I read about that. The reports were by isolating geolocation data from cell phones, that someone with a cell phone, I forget all the exact details, but someone with a cell phone that was commonly at an FBI facility in Virginia, I believe, or it may have been just outside of Washington, D.C., had visited the Crooks house. I think it was 8 times in the 2 or 3 months before the shooting. I have to tell you, geolocation data is a real thing. There's no doubt about that. I have not been able individually to verify whether those reports are accurate or not. I did read them.
Well, you take a look at the picture of the Crook's house. They look like a poor family. Just putting it out there. And and I don't think Crooks had a job. He had a lot of equipment. For a 20-year-old guy with no job from a poor family in this economy with all this inflation, for most households, it's hard just to put food on the table. And he had the resources to buy, guns and other kind of material. That seems a little suspicious.
Well, and he also had at least 2, according to the FBI, he had 2 improvised explosive devices that had viable functioning remote detonators. Now, I've read those reports. When I say I'm talking about the media reports about that, I don't know that the FBI has actually verified whether the remote detonators were viable or not. You would think that's something they would keep on the down low, at least till the investigations are all over with. But that would take an incredible amount of technical sophistication for this kid. Is it impossible? No. Is it more likely he had somebody helping him? When the Irish Republican Army developed that technology, they had to work with Basque separatists and get a bunch of engineers to do it. This guy's in a high school in Pennsylvania. So I have to think that if those reports are true, the guy had somebody with some technical expertise helping him.
Did you hear anything about the first shots that Crooks fired were directed towards the snipers, and initially they pulled back. They were startled and pulled back before they repositioned and then shot Crooks?
Yeah, I've actually that's one of the things. There's a hearing going on in Congress today about the task force to investigate the task force investigating the shootings, having a hearing. One of the things I'm really interested and hope that the task force can get to the bottom of is all the different information about the snipers. So I did hear the report you're talking about, but I heard conflicting reports, and then supposedly the sniper who actually took the kill shot on Crooks was a local sniper. It was not one of the Secret Service counter snipers. So I've heard a lot of conflicting reports about what Crooks's first shots were, who they were directed at, who directed counterfire at him, and it would seem to me that's something that the powers that be that are involved in this investigation could get together. It wouldn't take them a couple of days, and they could issue a report and tell everybody, here's how that happened. But that hasn't gone on. We don't know. And what we get are these conflicting reports, which don't inspire confidence.
So there was another issue. I don't think this has manifested into an assassination attempt yet, but I think it was the FBI that allowed a known terrorist to come into the country, and it was like a Good Samaritan, something like a Good Samaritan pass.
Right.
That this known terrorist got that I think he made threats to assassinate Donald Trump. So did you hear about that?
Yeah, I read about that, and you know what people don't realize. This is another issue that the news media and the government combined have not done anybody any favors. There are actually a number of known terrorists on the terror watch list, should not be allowed anywhere near this country, who've gotten into this country and been apprehended by the feds or by local law enforcement, and some of it's just by accident. So there was I forget the man's name, but is a Islamic radical terrorist who was apprehended in Texas just 2 or 3 months ago. And the only reason they found him, he's a guy's on the terror watch list. When they apprehend him, he's got massive amounts of munitions and guns and weapons and things. And the only reason they caught him is because he got in a dispute with a family member and pulled a gun on somebody, and they called the cops. And the cops get there, and then next thing you know, the guy's on the terror watch list. So that's actually happening. This happened several times. Now, that guy, to my knowledge, had not threatened to kill the former president. But look, we would have to be the luckiest nation on earth to not have sleeper cells of terrorists all over the whole country. So I think that until we get a handle on our immigration situation, we're going to continue to have problems like you just talked about. And
Yeah.
some of them are probably going to get worse, because we know now that Iran has multiple, supposedly, according to the briefings, multiple teams of assassins in the country right now, intending with instructions to assassinate President Trump. And what do you see the Biden regime doing about that? They just want to go full steam ahead with giving billions of dollars to Iranians.
Yeah. Well, they did protect the Iranian leaders in New York when they spoke at the UN a couple of days ago.
Yes.
Biden administration protected the Iranians, but now they have provided Donald Trump. I think there's a lot of DEI influence in the Secret Service.
Sure.
Some of the women, they did what they could. One woman did help them off stage, and she did what she could. But Donald Trump's a tall guy. He's a big guy, and no matter how dedicated you are or how fit you may be, if you only come up to his stomach or his chest, you can't protect that headshot.
That's right.
So anyway, that's disappointment to see some of that.
But I think that's a good point you make, and it's worth making, that the people who did the personal protection for Donald Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania, most of them fearlessly protected him when the shooting started. So I don't mean to cast aspersions on any of those people who that's not an easy thing to do, to step into the line of fire and put your body between a threat and cover someone. And they did that. I think even Dan Bongino said that the physical body protection people did their job well. But like you said, if I'm 6'4" and the person assigned to protect me is 5'6", there's going to be 8 or 10 inches of my head, my torso and my head that they can't cover, And so, but it is worth mentioning though, because it takes a lot of courage. I couldn't fall. I wouldn't. You saw some of the people were hiding behind stuff. I mean, when all those shots started ringing out, I think I would have been hiding behind something. So, they did a heck of a job there.
Yeah. Some have said that they shouldn't have given him time to seek his shoes, or should have got him off stage very quickly. Got him out of there faster. And there's one female Secret Service agent that couldn't reholster her pistol.
Yeah.
She's having trouble with that. But yeah, I mean, that was much better handled than what happened previous to that. Are you familiar with anything about this investment firm in Dallas they had a huge short position in DJT, Donald Trump's media company. They did like that Friday, put on a huge short position, expecting the stock to fall.
Yeah, I read about it, but I don't know. I don't know much more than what you just referenced. Unfortunately, sorry.
Okay, yeah, no problem. It seems like one of I do give the Democrats some praise here. My understanding there was a bill that was just passed a couple of days ago that said leading candidates should have as much Secret Service protection as the incumbent. The vote on that was 405-0. About 30 Democrats didn't show up for the vote, but still, a lot of them did vote for that, which is good. And Senator Blumenthal, in my opinion, seems to be doing a very good job with his inquiries. And he's a hardcore Democrat, but he is, as far as I can tell, being a real honest investigator.
Yeah, he's come out. He's come out in recent days and said that the Senator Blumenthal, in particular, has said that the American people are going to be shocked whenever they learn all the truth about what happened in Butler, Pennsylvania, and the failures of the Secret Service. Yeah, I was surprised to see him be as candid about that as he was. But I can just tell you that if one of the lead Democrats on that task force makes that sort of public statement, you can only imagine how bad it is.
Yeah.
Because he's going to try to sugarcoat it if he can. You would think, because that's ultimately the Biden administration, and Kamala is now, for all practical purposes, the head of it.
Yeah.
I don't think anybody believes that Joe Biden's running anything. I mean, I'm sure Kamala Harris isn't either, but she's the top of the ticket now. So you would expect Blumenthal to sugarcoat it if possible. So it has to be pretty bad. And I like you. I commend him for having the willingness to speak his mind about the topic.
Yeah. So a lot of the Democrats are, behaving honorably, I think, but the Biden administration itself, I don't think is. Just the other day, Biden was on The View, and they were talking about Donald Trump as being like a bug, saying he's a bug, and then, see my hand, Joe Biden was like this. You have to smash it. You have to smash the bug. And then his Secretary of Commerce said, talking about Donald Trump, is we have to exterminate. We have to exterminate and just get it over with. He didn't directly say exterminate Donald Trump, but it was right in that lowest speech. And there's an inconsistency. Democrat Biden, Harris say Donald Trump is a threat to democracy. He's like Hitler. He's going to be a dictator. Well, if he is like Hitler, I mean, would we logically, if he was a dictator, then we shouldn't be disappointed that there was an assassination attempt, right?
Sure.
I mean, if he's like Hitler, you should, want there to be an assassination. You wouldn't, be happy that the Valkyrie effort to assassinate Hitler wasn't successful. So there's a logical disconnect there.
Yeah, I've actually written about this as well. I had a 2-part article series on my Substack that said that the Biden regime and the Democrats and the media had blood on their hands. And I go through and outline all of the radical, violent, not all, but a lot of the radical, violent rhetoric that the media, that the Biden regime, and that Democrats in general have directed to President Trump. Representative Goldman said he needed to be terminated. Kamala Harris and President Biden have both said that he's a threat and needs to be stopped and all sorts of things like that. You had, if you remember the play that was running on Broadway where he was a person dressed like President Trump was being stabbed to death. If you remember Kathy Griffin holding up his head, severed head. If you Snoop Dogg's video where he's shooting Trump at the end, or a Trump lookalike called like Drump or something like that. Plus then you get Madonna standing in front of the White House saying that she thought about blowing it up. I mean, the Democrats use violence, and I've referenced this in the articles. I said the Democrats use violence, and a lot of this language in my opinion, is dog whistles. And a dog whistle, just for everybody, when you blow a dog whistle, dogs hear it, but other people don't. And the purpose behind a lot of this, in my view, is to inspire violence. The Democrats know, and the left knows, that there's a significant percentage of their base that are literal nut jobs. And that if they use this language enough, some of those people are going to be triggered by it. We see that with the second assassination attempt on President Trump. That guy, Ralph, is a leftist radical. And if you look at his social media before it got scrubbed, you'll see he used a lot of the same language that Kamala Harris and Joe Biden use. And so some of those people are going to be radicalized by that language. And for my part, particularly now that we've had 2 attempts that we know of, and we actually know now that there was more attempts on President Trump's life. There's at least a 3rd attempt. That in light of that, they continue to use that language. There's no other conclusion to reach other than they're trying to activate some of these wackos, and there's plenty of them, and we've seen it time and again. That man who shot up the congressional baseball game in 2017 was literally a leftist extremist, and so this happens all the time. We had the assassination attempt on Justice Kavanaugh. We've had Judge Cannon down in New Orleans. In Florida, who was presided over the Florida documents case, the federal Jack Smith indictment of President Trump, got hundreds of death threats, and a couple of people were charged with crimes for threatening her and threatening her life. And the Democrats still write all these just inflammatory things about this judge who didn't do anything except her job. And they know they're going to activate and radicalize some of these people. And it's on purpose, and it needs to stop. And some people need to be held accountable for it, in my view.
Yeah, and then all of what you said is true. Also, if you look at what you said in the context of what the Democrats have been doing for the last, it's maybe what is it now, 8 years. They're trying to run Donald Trump off the road. Whether it was the Russia hoax, the Ukraine hoax, the impeachments, and then more recently, as you participated in the program we had a few months ago on Get Trump, we went through about 7 or 8 litigations against Donald Trump. Everything, from trying to sue him into poverty so he can't compete, to incarcerate him.
That's right.
Have him convicted as a criminal, removing him from the ballots or not putting him on the ballots in the first place. You just kind of Tucker Carlson, so you just blot it out. If you keep trying and nothing else happens, at some point the next step is an assassination. And all of the things you mentioned about the Democrat dog whistle are very important. But the thing that really upset Barr, the previous Attorney General, was this current Department of Justice published the letter that Ruth, the second assassin attempt, wrote a letter saying that there's a $150,000 bounty on killing Donald Trump. Now, if I'm a average guy, not that well educated, and I have a gun, and the government says that Trump's an existential threat, he's a threat to democracy, and the government publishes this bounty, even though they didn't author it, they published it. They could have redacted it. They didn't have to publish it. Could have redacted $150,000 bounty. I said, well, government's going to give me $150,000 if I remove this existential threat. It's worth a try. So I think that is definitely incitement to motivate more assassins.
There's not much, many other conclusions to reach. The reality is that typically what the FBI does, like in the case of the Nashville transgender shooter, with the manifesto, is try to bury it so nobody ever sees it. And then you get this guy's, open letter to who, I don't know who he's writing to. I don't know that they've disclosed that. And he talks about this bounty, and they just dump it in the public domain. I suppose we'll have to see whether they claim it has some sort of investigatory value to release it. But Yeah, I think it's utterly baffling why they would, at the very least, not redact parts of that. But if it's look, in any other context, we would get, if it was released, it would be so redacted there'd be nothing to read. But since it's Trump, just dump it out there and let it ride.
It's very dangerous.
It is dangerous. It's extraordinarily reckless. The only positive to come out of that is that $150,000 really isn't much money for for that type of thing.
For some people, it is. Some people say it's about 5 years worth of work. I get that. In a couple of days of work or what have you. It's not something we want to get out there. Anyway, you're being very generous with your time. We'll end in just a few minutes. I'll just mention a few things you can opine on them if you wish. Anything with BlackRock, my understanding is both assassins, attempted assassination attempts, did commercials for BlackRock. How did Ruth know where Donald Trump would be? The agenda wasn't scheduled, wasn't published. And the last thing is Donald Trump was blamed for his own assassination attempt. So, he's not the one, riling people up. I guess he put his fist in the air after his head was almost blown off, and said, fight on, fight. And then that was blamed for retroactively causing the assassination attempt. But anyway, you can say a few words in conclusion.
Sure. Well, the question that you raised about the shooter or the attempted or purported assassin down at Mar-a-Lago, to know President Trump's itinerary or schedule is a real open question, because according to the FBI, the geolocation data using Ralph's phone, put him in the general vicinity of where he had set up his little sniper's nest for 12 hours on the day in question. So the legitimate question there is, how did the guy know that President Trump's going to be at Mar-a-Lago on that day? How would he know that he might play golf? And then since then, more reports have come out that now these are anonymous and as of yet unverified reports. And I tried to update, or I did update my search on this before we started our talk today. But the unverified anonymous reports are that somehow this guy got President Trump's itinerary for about 3 months, from August, September, I forget the exact time frame, but he supposedly got President Trump's itinerary for a 3-month period that nobody would have access to. So, and that's led some commentators, they assume that's true, and they say, look, he had to have some inside help in order to do that. Obviously, if that proves to be true, it'd be a very disturbing development. But, here's what's really disturbing about that whole thing is, if the FBI is correct and this guy was in this little sniper's nest for 12 hours, that would mean that the president came out to play golf on his golf course and no one cleared the perimeter at the start, because the guy would have been discovered then, before the president ever got on the golf course. Now, I'm not a Secret Service agent, and I've never protected anybody, but it would seem to me that that's pretty basic. You sweep the course before the president gets on it. It wouldn't even take that many people. They apparently didn't do that, because they would have discovered the guy. And it was a perimeter check, we now know, is what did discover the guy. But they didn't do it until after the president had played 3 or 4 holes of golf. So there's a lot of questions about that one. And I keep waiting for this guy to turn up like Jeffrey Epstein, because this guy's alive and he can answer questions. So we'll know if the real fix is in, if something bad happens to him while he's in custody.
Well, I think if you look at other actions that the Democrats have taken, when Trump was president, they tried to accuse Donald Trump Jr. of treason, which carries the death penalty, and some completely fabricated nonsense. The young man could have, gotten the death penalty. They authorized to use deadly force, the Mar-a-Lago raid. There was no reason for a raid. They could have used subpoenas in the first place. Just the extent to which they've gone to lie about Donald Trump planting classified documents, or just giving pallets of classified documents and then demanding to turn immediately for certain ones. It doesn't seem that far-fetched that there could be some elements within the deep state that do want Donald Trump assassinated, and constantly demonizing him as a threat to democracy. And that if there is an assassin, people say, well, he shouldn't have done that, but at least he saved democracy.
Yeah, right. I often tell people that no one in the history of American politics has been more viciously lied about than Donald Trump. And there's so many people, and I deal with this fairly regularly, not as much now as I had in the past, but I deal with people who don't know the truth about Trump. And I can tell you, whether we're talking about the Russia collusion hoax, which was in large part a concoction of Hillary Clinton's campaign and the Democrat National Committee, and whether we're talking about the Charlottesville Very Fine People hoax, whether we're talking about the false claim that President Trump removed Martin Luther King Jr.'s bust from the Oval Office on his first day. I mean, it's just lie after lie after lie after lie after lie that's been directed at Donald Trump. And so many people don't know that those lies are lies. And the good news is when they find out the truth, most people get angry about it. So I've explained to people, a number of people over the years, about the Charlottesville Very Fine People lie, and about, that's one of the big ones, the drinking bleach lie, if you remember that. Oh, you drink bleach to cure COVID, which he never told anybody to do that. And when you show people, say, wait a minute, here's what the truth is. Let's look at the Trump Tower meeting. That was a setup by the person that had been hired by the Democrats. That was Fusion GPS, who were hired and sent the Russian lawyer in to do the Trump Tower meeting. And when people learn that stuff and they see what the truth is, they get angry about it. And you've seen a number of illustrations of that. The actor Michael Rappaport, who's a little bit unhinged anyway, and when he was like, hey, all that stuff was lies, when he found out what the truth was, he was angry. People have been lied to so often, so pervasively, so systematically with respect to Donald Trump. To me, it's just it's a testimony to the resiliency of the American people and to President Trump's character and his sheer force of will, that there are enough people who think favorably of him for him to win this election. Because all the things that you talked about, all of the lawfare, all the efforts to disqualify him, all of the efforts to put him in prison were all intended to do one thing, and that was stop him from winning this election. That's it. And by that measure, they're utter failures, which is why, like you're talking about, it gives credence to the worry that the people behind all those machinations are going to go to the next step, which is assassination. And I don't mean to accuse any individual person in particular, but obviously that's a legitimate concern.
Right. Well, you've done a fantastic job of educating us. So thank you for sharing your valuable time. I know you do have a profession to run. So very generous of you to spend all this time educating, informing us. And for our listeners, you can get more education from Daniel R. Street. He has a Substack and a series of books dealing with the fake news, trying to target Trump. So I guess your books are available on Amazon.
They are, and anybody that wants to follow me can go to my website. It's danielrstreet.com. There's links to my Substack, link to my books, links to my social media. They can follow everything I'm doing.
Okay, so go to danielrstreet.com.
Yes, sir.
All right, Dan, thank you so much. This was a wonderful session, wildly informative and very helpful.
Hey, well, thanks for having me, and thanks for all you do. And I really enjoyed it. And, hopefully President Trump will win the election and we won't have one of these, won't need to do this talking about the election. But if you ever need my help again, just let me know.
Okay. Thank you so much. It was a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Take care. Goodbye.